I would love to start with this kind of like general setup question, which is, okay, so history, film, and anti-racism, like those things, people aren't thinking about all of those things together. So why is it important that we actually are talking about these three things as we are working to create a more just and equitable and anti-racist world? All right, so who wants to take that one first? So this is just, we're setting it up for everybody and helping them to understand this connection. This makes sense to all of us, but if it doesn't make sense to you why we're talking about this, why are we talking about these three things together?
Well, the past is not fully past. My students teach me that every day. And we need the history of the identity crises that a lot of us go through as we try to overcome the racist socialization we've had. And a lot of that socialization came through cartoons when we were little kids, and it continues through our teenage years and into our academic lives. I was a graduate student at a time when affirmative action was supposed to have been changing the landscape of a lot of employment opportunities. And it became really clear to me that students considered us inferior based on a lot of stereotypes they found in film. Because segregation has been so successful in this country. A lot of us don't know each other. And we rely on those stereotypes, and we call it wisdom, we call it information. And I think it's important for us to start to disconnect ourselves from them and realize that we've got more depth and it can be represented on film. We just have to do it.
When I started out in your class, Dr. Sawyer, we were talking about coons, mammies,
From ethnic notions.
Yes, right.
Ambos and pickaninnies.
That's right. And that was well over, I want to say 20 plus, 25 years ago.
It was 32 years ago, sweetie.
Oh, was it? Oh my gosh.
I did the math a little while ago.
The point I'm making is I'm still dealing with those kinds of images, but now we call them the magical Negro. We call them the white saviors. And I'm constantly combating those kinds of images in scripts that I'm reading and in stories that I'm seeing. So not much has changed, except that now more Black people are able to participate in terms of creating stories. And now I think people are willing to listen to our voices because we've just been through Oscars So White, and we now know we're talking a little bit more openly about systemic racism in our country. Well, that spills over into our industry as well. So I will say not much has changed, but the change is coming like through creatives, I suppose, like us, who may, say, hey, I have an issue with that. And now I think people are more willing to listen to what our concerns are a little bit.
Absolutely. Aunjanue, what's been your experience with kind of combating these stereotypes and seeing that play out in your work?
I just did a film with Christine Swanson, with Christine. And we spent a lot of time talking about these issues and how we were in a creative capacity, we're going to have to fight these stereotypes that you mentioned. And I think from that experience and from so many experiences that I have accumulated over the years, and I have to constantly be vigilant as someone who acts, as someone who, in my acting capacity, sometimes people listen to me and want to change or make adjustments based on thoughts that I have. Any great collaborator, director, writer will do that. And I've been fortunate. I was particularly fortunate in the project that I worked on with Christine to have that process. And I think what I have come to the conclusion, and I'm sort of guiding myself with this, is that even though, as Christine mentioned, that we are in positions of power more so than we were, we cannot assume as consumers, as fellow artists, fellow directors, fellow writers, that those who are now in those positions to not just create, but to be moneyed as producers, and because we all creators, but if you that doesn't guarantee that your work will see the light of day. But when you are someone who gets your work produced, we on the other side of it, we cannot stop being vigilant and assume that these directors and these writers are going to see things the same way that we do. So we cannot assume that because it is a Black director, because it is a Black writer, that the scripts that they're making, the scripts that they're writing, the scripts that they are producing will be negative of or nil of these stereotypes that Ms. Sawyer was referring to. As a matter of fact, we have to be even more vigilant. Because and hold our sister directors and writers. We have to hold them accountable as loudly and fiercely as we would white directors and writers and producers.
Absolutely. So Christina and Aunjanue, what does that look like? How do you actually hold this space accountable for recognizing, identifying that these stereotypes are happening and then transforming them into something else?
You know, what's interesting is when I was working on that particular movie with Aunjanue, there were several passes of the script that came in front of me that I didn't even take note of certain issues that were very problematic, because I thought that was that was a characteristic of the people that we were describing. So we were doing a movie about the Clark sisters, and they were heavyset women, and that was referenced continually in the script, and it just went right past me, right? And then I connected with Aunjanue, and one of the first things she said was like, "We're not gonna do this," you know. And I'm like, and when she made her point, I was like, she's absolutely right. Why are we focusing on these elements of these brilliant Black women that really, leans on something really trivial and negative, as opposed to the more substantive elements of what they represented in their lives? And so I don't know, Aunjanue, if you do that on every movie you go on, you create those kinds of opportunities to look a little bit, to dive deeply. But I felt in that moment when she brought those things to our attention was that it's a collective effort. Because left to our own devices, like I said, that went over my head, and what a shame, So I think it requires like this kind of openness to correction and a persistence to doing better, and not one person has all the knowledge on that. So it certainly helps to be open to what others think,
Yeah.
So it sounds like you're saying you need allies as you're doing these films.
To say the least.
Yeah. Aunjanue, do you typically do that on your films, or was there something different about the film that you were on where you felt called to? I know you've had an amazing career. So are there other times where you have done that before, and where does that come from?
I do it as much. I do it particularly when I am telling the story of someone who actually is a person who lived.
Mm.
When I am part uh, of the project of telling the story that is fictional, I give it a lot. I give it a wide berth. I give it a lot more leeway. And if I'm not just personally offended and feel, I wouldn't do it. I just wouldn't do it. The likelihood is I just wouldn't do it. I wouldn't audition for it. But when you have the responsibility, and I do not take that responsibility for granted at all, when you are playing someone who actually lived and their families are still alive and it's of historical record. I think particularly because the academics on this panel will attest to that our history has been so vulnerable and so systematically and intentionally erased and pillaged, and that when I have been in a position where I could ensure that the truth is told, that when particularly Black women, the stories of Black women, real Black women, that it is as expansive and respectful to those women as possible. So in those situations, I am a pain in the ass to directors and producers and writers. And I think we have to be that way. I think we have to be that way. And I think, it's something that Christine spoke to. I think she should give herself a break and not, feel ashamed about that, because as she will attest to, when you are someone says this, all this, I heard a director say this, a movie getting made is a miracle. So when you are the process of developing and then getting on set, that actually happening is a miracle. So there's so many pieces that you have to keep in place that you are just trying to get the thing done. Mm-hmm. That yes, you need that other voice to come in and say, hey, wait a minute. But as you were in that function, I act as an ally to my sister storytellers in that sense.
And speaking of allyship, it was without the help of the weight of the position that Aunjanue held, there's a lot that I don't know that I would have personally accomplished. So it's like, I guess we can speak to a specific allyship experience that happened, and because that happened, and she lent her weight to helping push along specific narratives and or cutting out others, we were successful with that. And again, I guess that's what allyship is: people using their powers to help less empowered people to accomplish goals or arrive to a great vision.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Dr. Sawyer, I see you nodding there. What are you thinking right now?
Oh, I'm just appreciative of the Clark sisters and the way you two brilliant filmmakers put it together, because I watched it again yesterday and realized that I was seeing my life reflected as a preacher's kid. And that's never happened before, ever. A preacher's daughter in particular. And thank you for that.
Absolutely. And as a historian, as we're thinking about the different stereotypes, Dr. Sawyer, can you talk about how you saw Black church women represented differently, potentially, than what we have seen in the past when we're not perpetuating these different stereotypes that are so damaging?
I've typically avoided stories about Black churches that were fictional or based on real characters, because I get so annoyed at the way church ladies are portrayed, with fans and all of the attention on their weight, all of the attention on the noise and the incoherent. lives they're leading.
Mm.
I'm not going to give any examples because I don't want to throw dirt on anybody, but I'm really, I was really, as being raised in the church, I knew what church congregations look like. I knew what the noise was all about, and I find churches basically and church members disrespected in most films um, about Black Christians, with almost no emphasis on Black liberation theology, which I think is what most Black churches are led by and believe in. And when you get finished with a film about a Black church that emphasizes all of the noise and all the confusion and all of the gossip, then you don't really see where these incredibly activist, brilliant Black ministers come from. These brilliant Black women. My goodness. Stacey Abrams is from the Black church. She's brilliant. And there's nothing in most films that would lead you to believe that, oh, okay, this is where these folks come from. They're not instructive, they're insulting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't think that that can be overstated. And I think that how how churched Black women are portrayed in film and television in such an insulting and reductive and diminishing way is addresses the larger problem of how Black women are demeaned and reduced. And I think that my experience in working on the Clark sisters has taught me so much about that, has been incredibly instructive. The filming the Clark sisters was an absolute joy, not without adversity, but I enjoyed every minute of it, and that had a lot to do with my director. But the other side of it, which was presenting it to the world, we had this tremendous response. But then what happens is your baby is presented to people who don't have any understanding of that experience outside of stereotypes, outside of that noise that you addressed, Professor Sawyer. They don't have any understanding of it. I think there's a great deal of fear there. I think there's a great deal, whatever it is. So what we faced, Christine can speak more to this, was an absolute indifference, almost to the point of hostility, if I can say, I can say that, to not even want to engage with the film at all. And what ended up happening was that when these conversations started happening about these critical conversations, when I say critical, I mean the critical community of the press, right? When these conversations started happening, what we would do is we would be engaging with someone talking to us about the movie. What she and I would end up doing was spend 10 minutes before we got to speak about the aesthetics of what we were doing. We had to justify the existence of what we were doing. We had to justify why anybody should even want to watch this story.
Wow.
Before we could talk about the aesthetics, before Christine could talk about why she chose to do certain shots, right? Her shot selection. My process, the process of these brilliant young women who were singing like the incredible Clark sisters. Before we got to do any of that, we were literally asked, why should anyone care? That was a literal question that we asked. Why should anyone care? And so for everybody who's listening to this on the panel, and the people who are on the Zoom, who are not just participating, but listeners, what you have to hear in that question, and what I heard in that question, is not just why should anyone care about the Clark sisters, but why should anyone care about the experience of Black women? Why should anyone care, particularly about the experience of working class Black women? Why should anyone care about the religious life of churched Black women? And what is so absurd about that is that so much that we identify with, I would call it, I'm going to use this word because it's easy to do, right? What we would call the sort of racial progress that has happened in this country, we would not know what that looked like if it were not for these women.
Right.
We would not know what it looked like. So there's so much misinformation. They don't know that Black women organized the March on Washington. They don't know that churched Black women like Dorothy Height organized the March on Washington. They don't know that. So in terms of allyship, right? This conversation about allyship, that it boils down to that question, particularly in this, we're talking about my experience and Christine's experience in our work, that when you ask that question, why should I care about these particular Black women? You are saying, why should I care about the experience of Black women? And the larger question is, why should I care about the history of Black people in this country? Particularly if the face of that is not one that I recognize. And that is what has happened, because the face of it is when it presents itself as Black, as female, as working class, as going to church on Sunday, and sometimes 3 times in a week. You know, that's not something that is comfortable for people. They are comfortable with the presentation of one that is male, one that is masculine presenting. And these conversations, the academic community, the Black women critical community, we are the folks that are going to have to, and you guys are doing it, and so thank you. Hold that part of it, question it, call it out, hold it accountable. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Dr. Sawyer, Christine, I see nods and smiles.
I forgot, like, Aunjanue, when we did those interviews, like, we did talk like about 10 minutes about the genius of the Clark sisters and why their genius is on the level of Bruce Springsteen and any other white musician that our interviewers would know and appreciate.
Right.
And that's typically not how you jump into a discussion about really a successful movie.
Yeah. Right. Right. No one would have, no interviewer would ever ask, why should I care about Bruce Springsteen?
Yeah.
Why should I care about Bob Dylan? Why should I care? And so the Riant's response to that would be, well, everybody knows who Bob Dylan is, and everybody knows who Bruce Springsteen is. And my response to that is, well, not everybody. Bruce Springsteen and Bob Dylan are not our heroes. It's not to say that we don't appreciate their music. I'm not saying it at all. I used to rock Bruce Springsteen. You know what I mean? Dancing in the Dark is one of my favorite songs. But when I need a word, when I need healing, I'm not running to Bruce Springsteen and Bob Dylan. I'm not doing that. And Black folks are going to the Clark sisters, and that matters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dr. Sawyer, what are your thoughts?
That the Clark sisters also address the hierarchical nature of church leadership. As Aunjanue and Christine were saying, very, very masculine, very male. But I also saw reconciliation in the film between the mom and her daughters, especially around the issue of whether you can wear pants or not. That really struck a chord with me because my sister and I were not allowed to wear pants on Sunday for most of our young lives because it was too much like a guy, right? And we were young ladies and we were to conduct ourselves as such. I found that kind of reflection of my own experiences as really completely abnormal and so welcome. And I'm hoping we can build on that and maybe talk a little bit more about Black liberation theology and talk a little bit more about where civil rights activists really come from a female supported base.
Female-led base.
Thank you. That too.
So thinking about this interview that you did, and it was likely more than one, where you had to come and like explain why you were even there. Like systemically, what has to change so that that goes away, so that you're treated like any other director, any other actress, any other film team that comes into the room to talk about this amazing work that they've created? What has to change? I know that's a big question.
I pause because I think the answer is difficult to nail down. And how about this? And I don't know how naive this is, but I'm not living and creating based on how those people respond. I've made a decision a long time ago that I specifically want to create content for our people. And for the most part, I care about how they respond. And on that scale, I think we did extraordinarily well. So I think it gives me a little bit more, psychological freedom and less angst when I don't have to think about that. But that is not the way this business works. Because if you don't think about those people who are the tastemakers in the press, in our industry, then it could affect your ability to work on the scale and level that you may want to work. So I don't know there's an easy solution to that, except keep doing movies that are successful and make a lot of money. And then people will pay attention. And if it's, I think, because I think we did that. We made a successful movie, right? Well, and they were forced to interview us, Aunjanue. So they were there. We got the interviews. They just sounded dumb, with their questions. And we would have to beat them up a little, right?
Yeah.
And Christine, I really appreciate that perspective. And, +1 on all of that. What do you think has to change on their side? Because I'm definitely not suggesting that anything that you're doing needs to change outside of expanding into even more, right? What needs to shift in the mindset of these groups that we're going into so that the brilliance can be recognized? I know that's a big question as well, but what's one thing? Where do we start with this? Because this is the moment that we're in. We have people who are watching and listening in a way that they've never watched and listened in my lifetime before, right? So things are more open. That's what I want to believe. And that might be my, idealism coming through. So how do we take advantage of that?
I think that there has to be an unlearning that happens. I think that because I'm echoing Christine's pause because my knee-jerk answer is I don't know. I don't know. Like it feels like an unclimbable mountain, and certainly not something that is going to happen overnight. I feel every cycle when we have these sort of questions and award ceremonies and what all that stuff, these sort of they're perennial questions. They happen they happen all of the time. And a lot of it has to do with what gets produced. You know, we'll have a couple things that get produced like a year, and they have, you know, 200. So there's that. It's like how much access does the world have? So there's that. And you know, I have to say that one of the things that I've been forced in these conversations about the Clark sisters, about Dr. Maddie, playing Dr. Maddie. And I've tried to avoid that. And whether I want to or not, I have been asked, and have sort of my back has been against the wall, and have had to answer. I've had to answer to Black women saying to me, well, why didn't you get nominated? Why didn't you get nominated? How do you feel about not getting nominated? And so this has happened to me at least 3 times in very public, you know, Essence magazine, you know, the Hollywood Report, these kinds of conversations that I've had to answer. And so what my personal choice is, if I don't get nominated, I don't get nominated. I've been there 1,000 times, you know. But I felt like Black women more particularly, they were personally insulted that I didn't get nominated, personally insulted. So I was forced to have an answer, even though I wasn't interested in engaging in that conversation in the first place, because I feel it's not gracious to do that. So, but in this situation, I had to. Mm-hmm. And I think that because in the Clark sisters, like Professor Sawyer, she felt seen. She felt seen by that movie. You know, whether you argue with the aesthetics of it, the success of the aesthetics of the movie, there were a lot of people in this country, a lot of Black women, particularly a lot of Black men, who saw that and felt like, that's me, that's my mama, that's my sister, those are the songs we sang. And they felt affirmed by that. And in terms of Black lives mattering, Black art has to matter as well. So I think this is the work that you guys are doing now is kind of, you know, breaking that down. And there's so much cluelessness about who we are. It's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. You know, that's just the fact of the matter. It's just so much cluelessness about who we are. And I think that a lot of work has to be done by the academic community. You guys are doing that, and kudos to you for doing that. And I think it's like Christine said so wonderfully, is that, you know, I can't care. I have to have blinders on and keep doing it and keep doing it and know who I'm doing it for. Mm-hmm. That's my long-winded answer of saying I don't know. Mm-hmm. No. You know, yeah.
However, it occurs to me that you've already done a film that is anti-racist work, that the Clark sisters, because we see ourselves reflected, can be anti-racist work. Do you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because the beginning of anti-racist work to me is presence. Because the part of the project of anti-racism is erasure. Mm-hmm. So when the presence of an experience is a weapon against that. So yeah, yes.
And so, sometimes I honestly did not know the impact of this movie. Like, again, I think I was just kind of cluelessly trying to make a movie that my folks in Detroit would be proud of. And that's it. I'm not even joking. Oh. And honestly, like, maybe that's the way to do things. Instead of trying to please the white masters, why don't we just please ourselves and tell stories that resonate with us and our community? You know, so that's the goal. But you can't do that without allyship at all in this industry on any level. You know, short of making like home movies, I can do that. Okay, I have the equipment to do that, but there's a cost to any production. So there's so many different variables that come into play in terms of what the outcome is sometimes, you know? So what I got to experience in terms of allyship was, and the understanding that I have of it is, one, you can't do it alone, you know? And two, someone with more power than me has to acquiesce it and or open a door for me to go through. And without which, you know, I'm just spinning my wheels, you know? So that was kind of the experience that I had with Aunjanue being the leading lady, and you know, having a longer career. She kind of helped, you know, push some things along. And that has been my experience in this industry. Like with proper allies, things get pushed along quicker and through better means.
Mm-hmm.
I would like a little bit more of that, please.
For sure.
I think I want to say something, because this is like, you know, I've been thinking about this a lot in the last week. And I think it goes back to what I was speaking about earlier, in that we cannot assume because we have representation that that means that the projects, the films, the television series that we are going to see we will feel affirmed by them. We are going to feel seen and heard. We cannot assume that just because there's a Black writer or a Black producer, and to a larger extent and more important one, that there are Black executives who are green lighting these projects. We cannot assume that because we have Black executives at Netflix, Black executives at Amazon, that they are going to greenlight projects that, first of all, we want to see, and second of all, that tell stories that have the effect that we wanted, that Professor Sawyer had in Seeing the Clark Sisters, or in Seeing the Clark Sisters. We cannot assume that that is going to happen because we have Black executives at those companies. And for example, what I mean by that is we have to have real hard conversations about the Black experience. And what is the Black experience? What particularly is the Black American experience? And I think that cannot be said enough. What particularly is a Black American experience? Not what is the diasporic experience, but what is the Black American experience? Because that matters. It is very particular, it is very specific, particularly in its aesthetic value and its aesthetic presentation, not just politically. Its aesthetic value, and for example, what the Clark sisters do, you don't see that in Jamaica. Mm-hmm. You'll hear the rhythms, but that's not happening in West Africa or East Africa. You hear the rhythms of that, but the way that they do that is something that is specific to African American aesthetics. So we have to, in the way that we respect and honor, and we're having more of these discussions now, the truth of a culture, other cultures. We have to have that same respect for ourselves. We have to. And I'm not talking about, when I say this, I'm not talking about because somebody feels my pain, that doesn't qualify. Am I making myself, because what I've heard is, well, what makes me qualified to sing this song or play this role is because I've had a hard time too, right? I've had a hard time. My grandmother went through hell. My father went through hell. And so the Black American experience is reduced to horror and not celebrated for its aesthetic, specificity, and excellence.
Hmm.
Does that make any sense?
That makes total sense. And, I am not in your space, but I'm going to just talk as a consumer of this content. Scrolling through Amazon Prime and I saw Sylvie's Love. And I just, I always like to see what kind of movies are coming out, what kind of stories are telling. And what I loved about this story is that it wasn't really about being Black. It was about being, this young girl and her relationship and her family. It was a different socioeconomic class than you hardly ever see. And regardless of whether you, in your expert view, think that movie was good or not, it was just something different that you don't like. I didn't have to put on my armor to watch that movie because it wasn't about the suffering and the hard struggle, which is super valid, super important to experience, but it makes us one-dimensional, and we're not. And that's kind of what some of the things that I sparked in my mind as you were talking, Aunjanue.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's also the danger of, in speaking of allyship, and in terms of people who want to be in support of Black folks, it's like just check your trauma and make sure that that's not what you're bringing to the table to gain a sense of solidarity, because I'm not sure that I want to necessarily hear that, because we're still working out our own stuff, right? To Anjanue's point, when we cast the singers for the Clark sisters, one group of people would have looked at it and said, just cast actors because anybody can lip sync, and it really doesn't matter, right? Well, depending on the point of view that you have, like, it actually mattered to me that we weren't going to reduce their legacy to, essentially voiceovers or mimicking an experience.
The layman's interpretation of it. Yeah, no.
Right. So, and that might be sufficient for you, but it certainly doesn't do justice to what these women represented. So maybe having a person who understood that could then speak to it and say, no, we need to cast singers from the gospel experience who personally can access what that music means. And that means something to the storytelling that represents these particular women. So it's not just reducing our experiences and allowing other people's points of views to dictate what's sufficient for our storytelling. So it's I go through that a lot when white executives reduce things to, we could just do that. And is we can just do that basic? Yes. Well, we're not basic. And we don't have to be reduced to your basic understanding of our experiences, which is what I'm seeing recycled over and over a lot in terms of content that represents us.
To piggyback on what you just said, Christine, it is a sort of laziness, right? Because the idea is it's a Black face. It's a Black face. That's all we need is a Black face. We got that, right? We got a Black face, no matter where that Black face comes from.
Yeah.
We got a Black face. And that is so that if we don't see that and acknowledge that as appropriation, then we are we're endangering ourselves. Just because the appropriators are in Black faces does not mean that they are not appropriators. And so the other part of this is, when I was talking about the Black executives, I heard a Black executive recently refer to their series Malcolm and Marie. And this is not about I'm not trying to argue whether Malcolm and Marie was good or bad, but the writer of Malcolm and Marie was a white male director. This is a conversation about allyship, right? So the writer director is white, and he is male. So the director, in referring to Malcolm and Marie, she said, and she's a Netflix executive, she said that we want to show films that reflect the totality of the African American experience, like Malcolm and Marie. So this is not about whether you think Malcolm and Marie is a good film. It is not about that. But I think we have to ask the hard question of ourselves and our allies. Is that representative of the totality of the Black American experience if a white male director is giving us the Black American experience? Is it? Is it? I have to say no. I have to say no. And so this is another question of allyship here. I know that I know from my personal experience, I know from Christine's personal experience, that we have sat in those offices and said to those executives, we have stories that we want to tell about the Black American experience, Black women particularly, and have been turned down by those executives. And yet, this white and male director, producer, and writer gets to tell the totality of the Black American experience. So these are questions. These are the questions that I think that are essential to this conversation of allyship. Mm-hmm. I think what made the Malcolm and Marie movie even more problematic is that he has been confronted with this issue. And his response was, well, I collaborated with my co-stars, his co-stars being Zendaya and John David Washington. And so he felt that he was given permission. So for him, Professor Sawyer, that was his workshop.
I see.
That was his anti-Black racist workshop. Was for him, that's what it was. For me, what is problematic is it would be one thing if the story of Malcolm and Marie were simply a story about two Black artists trying to work it out, right? And they just happened to be Black people, and you know, but that was not the case with Malcolm and Marie at all. What he did for, I would say, a good 75% of that film is he talked explicitly and very personally about issues that are about the Black artist's experience. He spoke about things about authenticity. He critiqued authenticity, Black authenticity within his film. And my question is, what gives you the right to do that? Who are you to speak to Black authenticity as a white male? And for me, I this is my opinion solely. You guys probably will have something more expansive than me, but my opinion is you don't get to do that. You should not get to do that, especially now. You should sit down somewhere. And if you want to tell this story, if this is burning inside you to tell this story about Blackness and Black authenticity, I would say, young man, give yourself pause. And if you want to participate from those anti-Black racist workshops, what should come from that is, this is not my place. Right. It's not my place to do this. This is the place for a young Black man to tell this story, or a young Black woman. If you want to tell the story of the crisis of the 21st century artist in America, that's fine. But I'm not gonna, as a white male director and writer, I would not dare speak to what is authenticity and artistic authenticity for Black folks. That is not my place to do that. How I can be an ally is say, okay, Netflix, this shot you're giving me that I know I'm getting because I am white and male, I want you to take this shot and give it to a Black artist. Give it to a Black woman, give it to a Black man. That's what allyship is to me.
Absolutely. Christine, I see the nods.
Well, I agree. he could have used or acquiesced his power in a more productive way regarding that specific movie. And then to lean on his cast members because they're Black and say, this excuses, my irresponsibility in terms of telling this story, is really a prime example of poor allyship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, poor allyship, right?
Yeah. And I think that's something that can happen when people, are given an opportunity, they're enthusiastic, they have something that they want to say in the space of another group. You charge forward and do it versus thinking about what's the right way to do it. And so a big part of allyship is knowing where your place is, knowing when to step forward, opening the doors, creating the connections, and knowing when to step back, which is really any time that you have no firsthand experience about what you're talking about, regardless of what sector or industry you're in.
Can I say something? Because I think this, I think that this has to be said too. I think that white artists, white makers in my industry particularly, they sense a decentering because of what has happened in the last year. They sense a decentering. So in order for them to have a place, this is their response. It's a cynical response. It's a cynical response. And we have to hold them accountable for that. We have to talk about poor allyship, because the reality is it's not allyship at all. It's opportunism.
Absolutely.
Exploitation, actually.
Yep.
Say that again, Christine. What did you say?
Exploitation.
Yes. Sure.
And a manifestation of how real white supremacy still is.
Absolutely. Yes.
And internally, right?
Yeah.
So that if you showed him his limit, he might not even agree that the limit exists.
Or it's the level of privilege that allows someone to think that me doing this is okay. Like to be totally blinded in such a way that he would have no clue as to say, perhaps I'm not the right person to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then put these actors in a very vulnerable position now to have to defend their director because he's using them as a backup, So it's just kind of unfortunate all around, because he's functioning in a place of great, great privilege, and I don't know that, and maybe Zendaya maybe they had equal power. I don't know, but something was kind of off in terms of the balance of presentation in that storytelling that just I felt kind of missed the mark.
Well, the problem is not the person. The problem is the representation of the person, the reducing and diminishing of that person, which makes us, palatable. Yeah.
All right.
Which is why every Black woman role in their 50s, I want Aunjanue to play in everything that I do. because of this urgent desire to make sure that she gets things right, which is how I think all of us should look at things, with an urgent and intentional desire to make sure that we're doing right by these representations.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This has been fantastic. I just want to do one more round just to build on what you're saying, Christine. What can we leave people with? Thinking about history, thinking about film representation, thinking about anti-racism, what can we leave people with to encourage them to keep striving to do this right thing? What would you want to say to the audience as some takeaways?
Well, I think this is work to be done. And I don't know that we'll ever get to a place where there isn't work. And I think in terms of allyship, there's more work to be done for others who have totally missed the boat for generations. So it's like I'm personally tired. Like things happen now, I'm like, I don't care, unless it affects me and mine, because I don't have the bandwidth to take all that in, because y'all gonna do what y'all gonna do anyway, you know? So but it does affect me. And to the extent that it affects me, I hope the takeaway is that we got a lot of work to do, but we include y'all. So get to work, y'all, is the takeaway.
Thank you. Aunjanue, Dr. Sawyer.
I guess I would suggest that people put themselves in check when they offer opinions or decide that they know what somebody else's experience can be and that they represent it. I think we all need to take a big dose of humility for a second and let the person who we're addressing speak and listen. Because there are a lot of Black experiences I still need to learn about. I mean, Clark Sisters was right on target when it showed just how captured those young women were in that parsonage. You got to get out and find out what the world's about and stop assuming that you know.
Mm. Beautiful.
I think that for everyone who's listening to this Zoom cast, first of all, thank you, because your willingness to want to listen to this is, you know, a fraction of what most folks want to do. You know, so that's the first step. I mean, it's acknowledging that you have a great deal of learning and unlearning to do, and I would encourage you to be vigilant about doing that learning and doing that unlearning. And if you are ever in a position that you can accommodate or make the space for an experience that is not your own, to not assume yourself as a spokesperson for that experience, but get out of the way and let that person that person speak for themselves. And when I say speak for themselves, I mean make that movie. I mean make that music. So yeah, that's what I would say. And yeah, appreciate the efforts that you've started to make, and being on this panel is one of them.
Thank you. Thank you, Aunjanue. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Thank you, Christine. This was an incredible conversation, and we will continue to do the work.
Thank you. Thank you, Carrie.